Hi guys, how are you today? After a hard-working day, let's relax with this journey through history. If you're as excited as we are to dive into this captivating journey, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss out on more adventures into the past. Let's uncover the mysteries of the Middle Ages together. Hit that bell icon too, so you're always first in line for the next historical adventure. Early life and family dynamics. Nero was born into a family fraught with ambition, intrigue, and power struggles, an environment that shaped him from the moment of his birth. His mother, Agrippina the Younger, came from a long line of emperors, and she was fiercely determined to ensure that her son would one day sit on the throne. Agrippina's ambitions were not purely maternal love, they were political. She had been married to Emperor Claudius, and when Claudius's son from a previous marriage died unexpectedly, Agrippina saw an opportunity for her son Nero to inherit the throne. From the moment of his birth, Nero's destiny seemed preordained. His early years were marked by the political machinations of his mother, whose ambition knew no bounds. Agrippina's determination to position Nero as the heir to the throne was a central feature of his early life. But this relationship was far from straightforward. Agrippina's close relationship with Claudius, her careful control over the imperial household, and her manipulation of her son's future set the stage for a future filled with conflict. Though Agrippina worked tirelessly to place her son in power, she did not always enjoy the affection or loyalty of her husband. Emperor Claudius, while seemingly content to have Agrippina guide Nero's rise, was not entirely comfortable with the idea of her wielding so much power behind the scenes. Claudius himself was often depicted as a weak and indecisive emperor, and his reliance on his wife and various advisors meant that he was not entirely in control of his own court. Nero's early life was therefore one in which he learned the subtle balance of power through the actions of those around him, rather than from any personal wisdom or decision-making. Agrippina's intense involvement in Nero's early life led to tensions between mother and son. While Agrippina was determined to keep her son close to her and guide him along the path to imperial power, Nero's character was beginning to take shape. Over time, his reliance on his mother diminished as he sought more personal control over his destiny. Despite her overwhelming influence, which extended to every aspect of his upbringing and education, Nero was growing into a young man who would soon desire independence. The relationship with Claudius and the political struggles. Nero's relationship with Claudius, his stepfather, was complex. Claudius, while never fully rejecting the idea of Nero succeeding him, was often distracted by the political strife surrounding him. As a ruler, Claudius seemed detached from the ongoing intrigues in the imperial court. Despite his earlier success in consolidating power, Claudius's later years were marked by instability and uncertainty. He had been manipulated by various factions within his own court, and his inability to deal with the growing ambitions of his wife and son led to further complications. Interestingly, while Claudius is often portrayed as weak and easily influenced, it is possible that he underestimated the scope of Agrippina's ambitions. It was, after all, his decision to adopt Nero, placing him in line to succeed him. Yet Claudius was reportedly not particularly close to Nero, as the young boy was overshadowed by the towering figure of Agrippina. Claudius's death in 54 CE, under circumstances that some historians speculate were not entirely natural, opened the door for Nero to ascend the throne, but it also marked the beginning of a shift in the relationship between Nero and those who had helped him reach power. Mentors and influential figures, Seneca and Burrus. Nero's early reign, though short, was significantly influenced by two important figures, Seneca and Burrus. Their guidance helped stabilize Nero's rule at a time when the young emperor was ill-prepared for leadership. Both men were highly influential, yet their relationship with Nero was one that saw a gradual shift over time. Seneca, a Stoic philosopher and former tutor to Nero, was appointed as his advisor. Seneca had a significant impact on the young emperor's early education and was instrumental in guiding Nero's early decisions. He helped shape Nero's public image, emphasizing the ideals of stoicism, virtue, and moderation. Under Seneca's guidance, Nero's first years as emperor were relatively stable. Seneca was respected for his philosophical outlook and his efforts to bring moral clarity to a court that had long been mired in corruption. However, despite Seneca's best efforts to steer Nero toward a more thoughtful and restrained form of governance, the philosopher could not control the deepening desires of his pupil. Nero, growing more independent, eventually began to disregard Seneca's counsel, particularly as he grew older and more influenced by the distractions of the imperial court. By 62 CE, Seneca was forced to retire from public life, an outcome that reflected the growing divide between mentor and ruler. The relationship between the two was not one of permanent influence, as Nero ultimately sought a more indulgent and less restrained approach to ruling. Burrus, the Praetorian prefect, also played a crucial role in shaping Nero's early reign. Burrus was a pragmatic military leader who provided a stabilizing influence in the imperial guard and helped secure Nero's position early on. As a former ally of Agrippina, Burrus had the practical skills to manage the military aspect of the emperor's rule. While Seneca provided intellectual and moral guidance, Burrus ensured that the emperor's rule was secure in terms of military power. The relationship between Nero and Burrus was more direct, as Burrus was concerned with maintaining order and stability, often putting pragmatic concerns above ideological ones. Despite Burrus's influence, the political landscape of Nero's reign became more tumultuous over time. Burrus, like Seneca, found it increasingly difficult to maintain control over a ruler who was more interested in indulgence than in governance. By 62 CE, Burrus had died, and with his death, Nero's remaining stabilizing force was gone. The absence of both Seneca and Burrus marked the beginning of a darker period in Nero's reign, one where personal indulgence and excess would outweigh the principles of governance. Nero's personality and character development. Nero's personality was a blend of contradictions, especially in the early years of his reign. On the one hand, he had moments of restraint and genuine charm, particularly when he first ascended to the throne. His speeches and public appearances were often marked by a calculated, measured calm, and he initially presented himself as a ruler who would bring fairness to the empire. However, the complexities of his character began to unfold as he took more control over the affairs of the empire. Nero's deep desire for personal satisfaction and his obsession with the arts gradually pushed him further away from the governance of the empire. His love for music, theatre, and performances were well known, and he spent much of his time indulging in these passions, often at the expense of his imperial duties. Nero's self-image as an artist was not just a personal desire, but a means by which he sought to validate his power. His indulgence in these personal pursuits, performing in public, writing plays, and forcing others to participate in his artistic spectacles, was a reflection of his inability to understand the true weight of his responsibilities. It was this mix of youthful energy, philosophical guidance, and personal indulgence that created the Nero we remember today, a ruler who began his reign with promise but was ultimately undone by his own impulsiveness and desires. Nero's inability to balance the two forces within him, his early guidance from those who sought to steer him, and his personal drive for fulfillment would come to define much of his later reign. What began as a reign full of promise was soon overshadowed by the actions of an emperor who could not separate his personal whims from his role as a ruler of an empire. The concept of living dolls in Nero's reign. The term living dolls evokes a certain image of figures both animate and controlled, existing solely to please their creator. Under Emperor Nero's reign, this concept took on a deeper and more disturbing meaning. These living dolls were individuals, often slaves, prisoners of war, or those deemed expendable by the imperial court, whose lives were reduced to instruments of Nero's entertainment. In the serene but deeply troubling world of Nero's court, these figures existed for one simple purpose: to satisfy the emperor's personal desires, often at great cost to their own dignity. It is important to understand that the role of these living dolls was not born out of personal malice or cruelty in the traditional sense. Rather, it was a reflection of Nero's perception of his own divine status. In his mind, his role as emperor transcended ordinary human relationships and, by extension, the value of those around him. To him, the people of his empire were often little more than objects, either to be adored or discarded as his whims dictated. Nero's desire for control extended into the realm of entertainment. He was known to force those within his reach into various performances, often at their expense. These individuals would participate in acts, some cruel, some absurd, created solely for Nero's amusement. What began as a form of personal gratification became a public spectacle, one that spoke more to Nero's need to feel adored than any concern for the dignity of those involved. The social dynamics behind the living dolls. Understanding the role of the living dolls in Nero's court requires an exploration of the social structures of ancient Rome. The empire itself was vast, with deep divides between the elite and the common folk. Slaves, prisoners, and those on the lower rungs of society were not afforded the same rights or humanity as the ruling classes. In this environment, individuals were sometimes considered property, their worth measured by their ability to serve the whims of those in power. For Nero, these individuals were expendable in much the same way that a performer might be seen as a tool for entertainment. They were chosen not for their talents or their potential, but simply for their availability and perceived worthlessness. Their status in life, as dictated by their station in Roman society, meant that they were at the mercy of the emperor's whims. In this sense, the living dolls were not only victims of Nero's personal cruelty, but also of a broader system that viewed them as lesser beings. They were caught in a web of power, one spun by Nero's desire for adoration and entertainment. The deeper tragedy of their existence lies not only in their forced participation in Nero's spectacles, but also in the broader societal structures that allowed such treatment to be not only acceptable, but expected. The acts of entertainment, performances and spectacles. Nero's entertainment was not limited to the typical gladiatorial contests or public games that characterized Roman life. His tastes were peculiar, reflecting his eccentricity. It was not uncommon for Nero to demand performances in which his living dolls were forced to act in ways that degraded them for the enjoyment of his guests. These performances often took place in the private setting of his court, but their purpose was no less cruel. One of the more infamous acts involved Nero forcing people to perform in mock plays, where they would take on roles of subjugation, often mirroring their own status in the court. The boundary between reality and performance blurred, as Nero's subjects were made to live out their own humiliation, sometimes in ways that mirrored the treatment they received in life. For Nero, the act of forcing someone to perform these roles was a way to assert his dominance, to remind those around him that he was the ultimate authority. These acts were not without consequence. The humiliation of performing such tasks left deep psychological scars. Yet it was not just the public spectacle that defined these moments. It was the knowledge that one's value in the court was reduced to nothing more than how well they could entertain their ruler. To be a living doll was to lose one's autonomy, to be reduced to an object in the emperor's collection of amusements. The consequences for those who failed to meet Nero's expectations were severe. If they could no longer entertain, they were discarded, often cast aside in the most cruel manner. Some were sent into exile, others were executed. The ultimate irony of their situation was that, in performing to the emperor's desires, they never truly existed for themselves. They existed for Nero's pleasure alone. Reflections on the dehumanization of the living dolls. As we reflect on the lives of Nero's living dolls, it becomes clear that their plight was not merely a product of personal cruelty, but also of a system that allowed such exploitation. Nero's reign exemplified a deeper truth about the relationship between rulers and subjects in the ancient world. The emperor's power was absolute, and those at the bottom of the social hierarchy were at his mercy. For Nero, the value of a person was often determined by their ability to please him, be it through performing or simply submitting to his control. But there is a quiet tragedy in the lives of these individuals that speaks not only to their subjugation, but also to their humanity. Each of these living dolls was someone who had once been a person with hopes, dreams, and a sense of self. Yet, under Nero's rule, they were reduced to mere puppets, their worth defined solely by their capacity to entertain. This gradual erosion of their humanity, often unnoticed by the emperor or his court, was a quiet but profound loss. Their lives were shaped not by their own choices, but by the desires of a ruler who saw them as nothing more than tools. The tragedy of their existence lies not in the outward cruelty of their treatment, but in the deeper and more subtle degradation of their worth as individuals. They were, for all intents and purposes, stripped of their dignity, existing only to serve the whims of an emperor who cared little for the lives of those beneath him. In considering the use of living dolls in Nero's court, we come to understand a sad truth about the nature of absolute power. It is not only capable of corrupting those who wield it, but also of dehumanizing those who fall under its sway. Nero's treatment of these individuals was a reflection of his own insecurities and desires. They were his objects, to be manipulated for his pleasure. Yet, beyond this surface cruelty lies a deeper, quieter tragedy: the erosion of personhood, the stripping of identity, and the total loss of autonomy. As we reflect on their fate, we are reminded of the fragility of power and the ease with which it can turn into something that strips away the essence of human dignity. The living dolls were not just the victims of one man's cruelty, but of a system that allowed such cruelty to thrive unchecked. Their lives, though marked by suffering, offer a quiet but powerful reminder of the importance of empathy, dignity, and respect for all people, lessons that echo through history, soft and steady, like the passing of time itself. Chapter 3: Life under Nero's Control and the Loss of Freedom. 3.1: The Quiet Oppression of Nero's Court. Nero's reign, while marked by his indulgences and erratic whims, also bore the weight of a quieter form of control. The lives of those who served the emperor, whether as his advisors, entertainers, or subjects, were shaped by an unspoken reality, the gradual erosion of their autonomy. It was not the overt cruelty of a tyrant that defined their existence, but the subtlety of constant surveillance and the pressure to conform to the emperor's desires. Under Nero's rule, the imperial court became a space where personal freedom was continually undermined. Those within the emperor's reach were caught in a system where their actions, thoughts, and even desires were influenced by the whims of their ruler. The daily routine of life at court was dictated by Nero's mood, his passions, and his incessant need for adoration. For those serving him, their lives were tethered to this ever-shifting, unpredictable force. It is important to understand that this loss of freedom was not always immediately obvious. It was not marked by loud declarations or visible oppression. Rather, it crept into the lives of those at court, gradually constricting their actions, their thoughts, and their very identities. Those who were close to Nero found themselves bound by invisible chains, subtle, yet no less real for their quiet existence. The influence of Nero's personality on daily life. Nero's personality was one of contradictions. He was, at times, charming and eloquent, seemingly capable of ruling with fairness and grace. Yet beneath this facade, there existed a deep and unsettling insecurity, one that manifested in his need for constant admiration. This need extended to everyone in his presence. Those who sought to serve him or please him were expected to align their thoughts, actions, and even their very selves with Nero's fluctuating moods. For the living dolls under his control, this meant a constant dance of compliance, the act of adjusting themselves to the emperor's needs. They were not free to live lives of their own making. Their identities became malleable, shaped by the desires of Nero. A performer might find that their worth was not in their talent, but in how well they could meet the emperor's unpredictable expectations. A servant might see their value not in the service they provided, but in the degree to which they could be subservient to Nero's whims. This constant adjustment to Nero's ever-changing moods was a form of psychological control. It was as though the emperor's need for admiration and control slowly consumed those around him. In such a world, personal freedom, once taken for granted, was no longer a given. Every decision, every action was filtered through the lens of Nero's desires. The subtlety of psychological control. The loss of freedom under Nero's rule was, in many ways, psychological. The court itself was a space of subtle, often unnoticed manipulation. Those within it were taught to constantly anticipate the emperor's needs, to remain attuned to his preferences and demands. This constant awareness of Nero's expectations slowly eroded the sense of autonomy until the court's inhabitants found themselves acting out of habit rather than choice. Psychological control, unlike physical confinement, is difficult to perceive. It is gentle, almost imperceptible in its daily effects. It does not demand immediate compliance, but instead builds slowly, shaping behavior over time. In Nero's court, the constant need to please him took the form of a quiet, creeping pressure. The more an individual sought approval, the less they were able to distinguish their own desires from the emperor's. This gradual loss of autonomy became particularly pronounced among the living dolls of Nero's court. These individuals, who had once been free to lead their lives, now found themselves in a constant state of submission. Their identities, who they were, what they wanted, became secondary to the need to meet Nero's expectations. Each action, each word, was filtered through the lens of the emperor's desires. In this way, their lives were no longer their own, but an extension of Nero's power. The silent erosion of identity. The more one is subjected to control, the more difficult it becomes to separate their identity from the forces shaping it. For the living dolls in Nero's court, this erosion of identity was slow and almost imperceptible. It is not that they were overtly forced to act in specific ways. Rather, they were conditioned to perform according to an ever-shifting set of rules. They became mirrors of the emperor's desires, reflecting back what he wished to see. In the larger scheme of Roman society, this loss of personal freedom might seem small. After all, the emperor ruled with absolute power, and those at court were at his mercy. However, the psychological toll of constantly being shaped by someone else's whims is not easily measured. The living dolls may have once had their own desires, their own identities, but these were slowly replaced by the needs of the emperor. Their lives became a series of performances, each one aimed at pleasing Nero. Nero, with his own insecurities and insatiable need for admiration, shaped the very lives of those around him. This was not just a matter of personal control, it was a gradual transformation of others into extensions of himself. Over time, it became harder to discern where Nero's desires ended and where the desires of his court began. In this way, the loss of freedom became a quiet, unspoken reality for those caught in Nero's orbit. The loss of freedom under Nero's control was a process marked not by sudden moments of violence or oppression, but by a slow, insidious erosion of identity. It was a psychological process, one that crept into the lives of those at Nero's court, gradually replacing their desires with the emperor's. The court became a place where personal autonomy was no longer a given, where each individual's actions were shaped by the whims of Nero. In reflecting on this subtle form of control, we are reminded of how power, when unchecked, can slowly strip away the very essence of individual autonomy. Nero's reign was not marked by overt cruelty alone, but by the quiet manipulation of those around him, leaving them unsure of who they were or what they desired. The living dolls, once individuals with hopes and dreams of their own, found themselves reduced to mere reflections of the emperor's power, existing only to fulfill his needs. This loss of freedom was not dramatic. It was not the result of force or violence, but the consequence of a ruler who sought to shape the world around him in his own image. And in the quiet unfolding of this process, the true tragedy of life under Nero's control was revealed, not in the actions themselves, but in the gradual erosion of the sense of self. Chapter 4. The Small Rebellion and its Tragic End, the Quiet Stirring of Defiance. In any long period of subjugation, there comes a time when the human spirit, even when dulled by the weight of oppression, stirs quietly against its chains. Under Nero's rule, where power was absolute and the emperor's whims reigned supreme, there were moments when the living dolls under his control, though silenced by the enormity of their circumstances, experienced fleeting glimpses of defiance. These moments were small, hardly noticeable at first, like a whisper in a room full of shouting voices. The rebellion was not marked by loud protests or acts of violence. Instead, it appeared as the smallest, most personal gestures, a subtle refusal to comply. A brief moment of hesitation, an internal resistance that, though muted, was no less real for those who felt it. These quiet rebellions were not born of strategy or grand ideals, but of a simple, human need to reclaim some fragment of dignity, some sense of control over a life that had long been denied agency. In the presence of such overpowering control, the acts of rebellion may have seemed inconsequential, like the faint rustling of leaves before a storm. They did not shake the foundations of Nero's empire, but they served as reminders of the silent persistence of the human will. The very existence of these small acts of defiance was a form of resistance, however fleeting or imperceptible. The illusion of choice and the power of submission. The living dolls under Nero's reign existed in a strange limbo where their choices were not their own, and yet they were forced to make decisions every day. These choices were not about freedom or justice, but about survival in a world where autonomy had been stripped away. Their rebellion was not in the form of an uprising, but in the quiet refusal to fully yield to Nero's will. However, the true nature of their rebellion lay not in what they could or could not do, but in the realization that their lives were not entirely within Nero's grasp. For a moment, some of them might have seen the truth, that they were more than mere tools in the emperor's performance. Even the smallest acts of resistance were a way of asserting their humanity in the face of an empire that denied it. Yet this rebellion was always limited. The structure of power in Nero's court was absolute, and any form of resistance, however small, was met with swift and unyielding force. The living dolls had no space in which to flourish, no opportunity to build a movement. Their rebellion could not escape the confines of their roles as entertainers, subjects, and objects of Nero's entertainment. The small acts of defiance, although meaningful to those who enacted them, were always doomed to failure in the context of Nero's overwhelming power. The inevitability of consequences. As with all moments of rebellion in the face of overwhelming power, the inevitable consequence was that those who resisted were silenced. In Nero's court, the line between compliance and defiance was thin and easily crossed. The slightest hint of insubordination, no matter how small or subtle, could lead to dire consequences. For the living dolls, there was no room for error. The acts of rebellion, although personal and sometimes unintentional, were soon noticed. Nero's court was not a place where even the faintest challenge to authority could go unnoticed. The emperor's reaction to resistance was predictable, not in its intensity, but in its finality. Once someone was seen as a threat, no matter how minor, they were eliminated. This elimination, whether through public execution, exile, or worse, was the final end to the quiet rebellions of the living dolls. What is perhaps most tragic is that these small acts of defiance, though important to those who experienced them, held no power to alter the course of Nero's rule. The rebellion was crushed not through force, but through the suffocating control that left no room for escape. The lives of these individuals, though marked by brief flashes of resistance, were ultimately shaped by a power far greater than themselves, one that left no space for anything but compliance. The quiet end. Tragic finality of the living dolls. When the inevitable consequence of rebellion came, it was not in the form of great spectacle or dramatic downfall. Rather, it arrived in the form of quiet erasure. The living dolls, who had once danced and performed for Nero's amusement, were cast aside with little fanfare. Their ends were often unremarkable, the result of a power that had long been absolute and a system that had made them into tools rather than humans. Their tragic end was not one of sudden violence, but of gradual disappearance. For some, it may have come in the form of silent exile, away from the public eye. For others, it was the cold, indifferent death that followed their perceived failure to entertain. The consequences of their rebellion, however small and personal, were always final, and they were delivered without emotion, in keeping with the regime that had made their lives insignificant. The tragedy of their existence lay not in the grand spectacle of their end, but in the quiet, unseen suffering that marked their lives. It is in this gentle disappearance that we understand the true cost of submission and the limits of defiance in an empire governed by such an overwhelming power. The living dolls were not just forced to entertain, they were forced to lose themselves, to become mere reflections of the emperor's desires. Their rebellion, however small, could not escape the confines of this role. In the quiet, subtle rebellions of Nero's living dolls, we see the faintest glimmer of humanity in the face of an empire that sought to strip it away. Their resistance, though small and ultimately futile, was a testament to their inner desire to reclaim something of themselves, to remind the world, and perhaps themselves, that they were not mere tools. In the presence of such overpowering control, the acts of rebellion may have seemed inconsequential, like the faint rustling of leaves before a storm. They did not shake the foundations of Nero's empire, but they served as reminders of the silent persistence of the human will. The very existence of these small acts of defiance was a form of resistance, however fleeting or imperceptible. The illusion of choice and the power of submission. The living dolls under Nero's reign existed in a strange limbo where their choices were not their own, and yet they were forced to make decisions every day. These choices were not about freedom or justice, but about survival in a world where autonomy had been stripped away. Their rebellion was not in the form of an uprising, but in the quiet refusal to fully yield to Nero's will. However, the true nature of their rebellion lay not in what they could or could not do, but in the realization that their lives were not entirely within Nero's grasp. For a moment, some of them might have seen the truth, that they were more than mere tools in the emperor's performance. Even the smallest acts of resistance were a way of asserting their humanity in the face of an empire that denied it. Yet this rebellion was always limited. The structure of power in Nero's court was absolute, and any form of resistance, however small, was met with swift and unyielding force. The living dolls had no space in which to flourish, no opportunity to build a movement. Their rebellion could not escape the confines of their roles as entertainers, subjects, and objects of Nero's entertainment. The small acts of defiance, although meaningful to those who enacted them, were always doomed to failure in the context of Nero's overwhelming power. The inevitability of consequences. As with all moments of rebellion in the face of overwhelming power, the inevitable consequence was that those who resisted were silenced. In Nero's court, the line between compliance and defiance was thin and easily crossed. The slightest hint of insubordination, no matter how small or subtle, could lead to dire consequences. For the living dolls, there was no room for error. The acts of rebellion, although personal and sometimes unintentional, were soon noticed. Nero's court was not a place where even the faintest challenge to authority could go unnoticed. The emperor's reaction to resistance was predictable, not in its intensity, but in its finality. Once someone was seen as a threat, no matter how minor, they were eliminated. This elimination, whether through public execution, exile, or worse, was the final end to the quiet rebellions of the living dolls. What is perhaps most tragic is that these small acts of defiance, though important to those who experienced them, held no power to alter the course of Nero's rule. The rebellion was crushed not through force, but through the suffocating control that left no room for escape. The lives of these individuals, though marked by brief flashes of resistance, were ultimately shaped by a power far greater than themselves, one that left no space for anything but compliance. The quiet end. Tragic finality of the living dolls. When the inevitable consequence of rebellion came, it was not in the form of great spectacle or dramatic downfall. Rather, it arrived in the form of quiet erasure. The living dolls, who had once danced and performed for Nero's amusement, were cast aside with little fanfare. Their ends were often unremarkable, the result of a power that had long been absolute and a system that had made them into tools rather than humans. Their tragic end was not one of sudden violence, but of gradual disappearance. For some, it may have come in the form of silent exile, away from the public eye. For others, it was the cold, indifferent death that followed their perceived failure to entertain. The consequences of their rebellion, however small and personal, were always final, and they were delivered without emotion, in keeping with the regime that had made their lives insignificant. The tragedy of their existence lay not in the grand spectacle of their end, but in the quiet, unseen suffering that marked their lives. It is in this gentle disappearance that we understand the true cost of submission and the limits of defiance in an empire governed by such an overwhelming power. The living dolls were not just forced to entertain, they were forced to lose themselves, to become mere reflections of the emperor's desires. Their rebellion, however small, could not escape the confines of this role. In the quiet, subtle rebellions of Nero's living dolls, we see the faintest glimmer of humanity in the face of an empire that sought to strip it away. Their resistance, though small and ultimately futile, was a testament to their inner desire to reclaim something of themselves, to remind the world, and perhaps themselves, that they were not mere tools. Yet, as with all moments of quiet defiance under an all-powerful ruler, their efforts were doomed by the very nature of the system in which they lived. The tragic end of these individuals was not marked by grand gestures or dramatic struggles. It was, instead, marked by the slow, inevitable erasure of their humanity, a fate sealed not by their actions but by the unyielding force of an empire that demanded submission. In reflecting on these quiet moments of rebellion, we are reminded of the frailty of power and the quiet persistence of the human spirit, even when it is silenced. The living dolls are not remembered for the great acts of defiance they may have attempted, but for their quiet, often invisible existence caught in the grip of a ruler who saw them only as objects of entertainment. Their story, though soft and understated, carries a quiet yet profound lesson about power, submission, and the human soul. Chapter 5: The Corruption of Power and its Impact on Roman Society. The subtle erosion of authority. Power, when held too long by one hand, can gradually lose its original purpose. In the case of Emperor Nero, power, once wielded with promise, began to corrode quietly, both within him and throughout the empire. Initially, Nero had ascended to the throne with potential, guided by his mentors and the steady hand of his mother, Agrippina. Yet, as time passed, the weight of absolute authority, unchallenged and unrestrained, began to distort his judgment. It is important to understand that Nero's early actions were not inherently corrupt. The beginning of his reign, though heavily influenced by those around him, appeared to promise a more thoughtful future. However, as Nero grew more independent and began to indulge in his personal desires, his perception of power changed. His decisions became increasingly impulsive, guided not by reason or strategy, but by the fleeting whims of a ruler seeking adoration and control. The erosion of authority was not abrupt or violent. It unfolded slowly, almost imperceptibly, as Nero became more immersed in the lavish distractions of his imperial life. The true nature of his power, once rooted in the stability of the empire, began to bend toward his personal desires, and in doing so, he lost sight of the duty and responsibility that had initially defined his role as emperor. The strain on Roman governance. As Nero's personal desires took precedence over governance, the integrity of Roman society began to wane. The empire, once a beacon of order and structure, now found itself caught in the currents of excess and self-indulgence. Nero's increasing detachment from the empire's needs left Rome vulnerable, and the instability of the court became more apparent. The imperial bureaucracy, which had once functioned with a certain degree of coherence and efficiency, became a mere reflection of the emperor's own fragmentation. The emperors who followed Nero, whether briefly or with greater force, would inherit the consequences of his reign: a society weakened by a lack of focus, a court consumed by intrigue, and a populace left to endure the repercussions of an empire ruled by a figure more interested in performance than governance. The legacy of Nero's rule. The consequences of Nero's rule were felt long after his death. His actions left deep scars on Roman society, shaping the way power would be perceived in the future. The lavish distractions that had once enthralled him now seemed hollow in retrospect. Nero's reign became a cautionary tale, a quiet reminder of the dangers of unchecked power. The Roman Senate, once an active part of governance, found itself sidelined as the emperor's whims replaced the careful deliberation of the Senate. Nero's indulgence in power also contributed to the growing disenchantment with imperial rule. As the people of Rome witnessed the growing distance between their rulers and themselves, a deeper disconnect began to form. The emperor, once seen as a symbol of stability and unity, now embodied excess and separation. This was a shift that would resonate throughout Roman history, as the perception of leadership would begin to fracture, altering the way future emperors would rule. In the soft unfolding of Nero's rule, we see the slow corruption of power. What began as the potential for wise leadership became a quiet descent into indulgence, and the impact on Roman society was subtle but lasting. The strain on governance, the erosion of authority, and the gradual shift in how power was perceived created ripples that affected the very fabric of Roman society. Though Nero's reign was marked by excess and turbulence, it serves as a quiet reminder of the fragility of power and the delicate balance required to wield it with wisdom and restraint. Thank you for joining us. Rest well, take care of your beautiful self, whatever that means to you, and until next time, good night.